Thank you so much. Sasha?
Hello there. Like Victoria mentioned, my name is Sasha Weiss, and I am 16 years old, and I have not finished the school year yet. So I am a current junior at Oakwood School in North Hollywood, and I live in the Mid-Wilshire area here in LA. In addition to serving on the Mayor's Youth Council for Climate Action, I worked last summer as a Coro Youth Fellow. And as a part of my fellowship, I did work on environmental justice issues focused here in the city. And over the last 3 years, my friend Naomi Lopez and I have been developing a web-based platform called the High School Sustainability Guide that Victoria mentioned in her intro. And it's a guide built by and for high school students to be able to calculate and reduce their school's carbon footprint. And for anyone who is interested, we are looking to build partnerships with other schools and students to make this guide accessible and used by other high school students here in California and beyond. And I'm so excited to be here on this panel today, and thank you so much for including us.
Thanks, Sasha. Delaney?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for having us. And as Victoria said, I'm a rising sophomore at Barnard, double majoring in environmental science and anthropology. But before college, I grew up in Los Angeles and London as well, where I was able to observe how individuals and communities were able to perceive the climate crisis and respond to sustainable policies that were implemented by their government. And so for the past couple of years, I've spearheaded different environmental initiatives, working with different administrations and students to ensure that environmental projects are achieved through collaboration. And so locally, I was appointed by Mayor Garcetti to the Mayor's Youth Council for Climate Action, where we advised different environmental legislation, and we compiled this amazing environmental curriculum book for youth across LA for grades K through 9th to highlight the intersectionality of the climate crisis. And regionally, I also introduced an ordinance for a youth climate commission for Los Angeles County to help include youth in the legislative process, because I think it's so imperative for young people to be a part of the climate conversation in terms of environmental legislation creation, because we are the ones that are most impacted by the policies put forth today. And then internationally, I'm a director of advocacy for One Up Action, where I bridge the intersectionality of the climate crisis to show that collective action is really necessary for creating change through the Youth Climate Commission program, where we work with young people around the world to implement other youth climate commissions with their local governments. And currently at Columbia, I'm a part of the Build and Climate Action Fellowships, where I'm working on starting the conversation about zero waste on campus with the help of being a part of the Columbia Environmental Organization. And so just overall, my goal is to encourage collaboration and inclusivity and just overall education about climate change to ensure that everyone feels supported and informed about how to stop the climate crisis.
Now, Delaney, you have been involved in so many different efforts in climate action work. I can't believe you're, only going to be a sophomore in college. So can you tell me how you got started doing this work? What inspired you? Did you have a mentor along the way to help guide you?
Yeah, so I think I first started my environmental journey in London, where I attended this international school and I was surrounded by so many different students, and just hearing their perspectives and experiences that were vastly different from my own in growing up, and just hearing how they experienced the climate crisis and how it impacted their community just made me more socially aware of the crise's greater impact. So then just coming back to America, I had the motivation to educate as many people as possible on the crisis, to just encourage everyone to do their part, because it is so inclusive and every single person is impacted by climate change, regardless of your race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status.
Thank you. Yeah, I noticed that with the Mayor's Youth Council for Climate Action, sort of that what is interesting about it is that it brings together such a diverse set of young people from across the city who, even though they might be involved in the movement, may not have ever met each other before. And that kind of dialogue that happens in those meetings really has expanded people's horizon and inspired them to do, even more. That's great. And by the way, I'm going to be asking questions and I might direct them to one of you, but if anybody else wants to chime in, feel free. Sheetal, over the past few years, there's just been rising evidence of climate change and predictions about the future that feel, incredibly dire. And it's given forth what's been termed climate anxiety, where people feel really overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem. And we're seeing more and more young people, are experiencing this themselves. Have you faced this kind of climate anxiety? And how do you recommend people educate themselves so that they don't feel like it's just a completely bad news story that maybe they should ignore or just stay away from?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think something that definitely should be talked about a little bit more. I definitely have felt climate anxiety, definitely on the front where, in the past year or two, especially, like we're seeing so much bold climate action being taken, but then we also see a lot of political gridlock on things like climate infrastructure. We see, the increase in single-use plastics through the COVID-19 pandemic. It feels sometimes like we're taking, one step forward, two steps back. So definitely that has been very difficult to grapple with, especially, being surrounded sometimes by people who are interested in working to alleviate the climate crisis, but oftentimes, surrounded by peers who are working in entirely different fields that, kind of are like, yeah, climate change is important, but like, what am I going to do about it? So definitely that's kind of a very common mindset that is very frustrating and a little bit scary to think about. And so I think the two ways I've kind of tried to deal with it are, the first one is to acknowledge that it's okay to be anxious about climate change. It's, terrifying in a lot of ways. And being able to talk about that with other people who feel similarly has been really valuable. I actually recently in a class this year learned about Yale has a classification for the 6 types of climate change consumers in the United States, where they have a spectrum ranging from, I think, alarmed to concerned, all the way to not interested or kind of indifferent. And so there's a little questionnaire you can take on the website, and then they'll tell you which group you're in. And for me, that was very validating because they were like, oh, 30% of people agree with you right now. So I was like, okay, it's not just me. So that was one way that I think was really helpful in dealing with it. And the other thing is just channeling that anxiety a little bit into something that's more productive. So working in the climate sector, or if that's not possible, volunteering with a climate organization is really great. A lot of periodicals and newspapers now, I think, have a lot of newsletters that are coming out on a weekly basis with climate news. So that's a good mix of good and bad news to kind of give yourself a little bit of positivity every week. So the LA Times has one, the New Yorker has one, Climate Tech. So those are all things I would recommend.
That's interesting. I haven't seen that Yale study. So if you get a moment to put it into the chat, that would be great. Delaney or Sasha, do you have any thoughts on this issue yourselves?
Yeah, I definitely experience climate anxiety, and almost everyone I talk to who believes in climate change has climate anxiety. And I think one idea that I sort of found interesting to combat climate anxiety is to try and maximize your impact. So not just getting involved on an individual level, which kind of leaves it all to you, but actually stepping it up and maybe getting involved on an institutional level or getting involved in an organization. So you kind of take your individual impact and make that expand that to an actual institution or a physical building that might actually make a much more significant difference than if you were to just do something on your own. And also, I find that just educating myself and just trying to consume as much information as I possibly can, for me, has helped, but I know that can also stress some people out. And just when doing that, it's automatically kind of in the back of my head. And so as I go about daily life, I am automatically sort of mindful of how my actions are impacting the planet, which I think is very helpful. So I don't have to think about it so consciously all the time.
That's really helpful. You know, I was interested, Sasha, and maybe Delaney, you may have some thoughts on this as well. But, you know, with the website that you're building, it takes a certain degree of collaboration between, you know, a student as well as the, you know, faculty or administration within the school to be able to put this together, this carbon footprint, and then implement changes. How have you been able to, you know, what are some of the maybe successful ways you've been able to engage the older generation to help move the ball on this? And maybe could you identify some obstacles or tips on how to get through to older people?
Well, I definitely would say I faced the most obstacles when actually trying to implement the principles of the high school sustainability guide at my own school. And definitely the obstacles came before the successes. I would say we had a tough time trying to get our administration to sort of take us seriously. They would want us to try and tackle what they called the low-hanging fruits and not kind of get into what matters, which is it's not so glamorous, but like the utilities and infrastructure. And they didn't seem to think that we knew our stuff. And so we led a series of, we led one in-person strike and a couple Zoom strikes to try and get more momentum and try and get them to take us seriously. And since those strikes, we've created a petition that has a series of pledges for the school to adopt. And we tried to get as many signatures from stakeholders at the school to sign that. And finally, with all of that together, we got some responses from the administration. And since that petition, we have had a lot of success in working with the administration and forming a formal sustainability working group at the school. And so far, so good. Fingers crossed.
That's amazing. I did not know that piece about the website and the work that you're doing. And it kind of gets to something that the mayor talks about all the time, which is this like inside outside game of, you know, it's you can be an outsider and you have a great perspective and advocate, but it's also important to like have a plan of not just saying we don't like this, but having, you know, this is what we think you should do, and then working together to try and get to that point. And maybe it's not going to be exactly where you wanted, but you're going to get steps closer to that than if you have nothing at all. So that's really amazing. You know, you built this website, you advocated for it, you hit some obstacles, and then you let them know, hey, I'm not the only one who wants to see, you know, bigger changes than like an extra recycling bin at the school. So I love that. I think that was really helpful and illustrative. Delaney, how about you? I feel like you are an expert of the inside outside game.
Yeah, so I've had very similar experiences in terms of trying to start programs at different schools and just within the community and receiving that pushback, because I think the perspective is that only environmentalists or people who are really into sustainability care about these environmental initiatives, when in reality, it affects everyone and everyone will be impacted at some point by the climate crisis. And so doing those petitions and showing there is like this collective support in regards to different programs is really critical in addressing and making efficient change. And I think it's also really important to bridge that political change and advocacy with just young people and environmentalists who feel like they are on the outside in terms of climate action. And so finding ways to apply to internships and programs to have the opportunity to help drive climate advocacy within local government or within NGOs, I think is really critical. And I know from my experience working with Grades of Green, for example, which is an environmental nonprofit, it allowed me to lay a foundation and get the tools to learn how to organize and create educational guidebooks that were disseminated to young people around the world within that nonprofit, and then working with the Mayor's Youth Council for Climate Action, really being within local government helped me develop those relationships with policymakers and individuals like Victoria and Lauren Farber, who didn't just guide me through local sustainability, but also gave me the tools and foundation on how I can just properly advocate for myself and the environment. Because I think in school you get the academic foundation, but learning how to advocate and create effective change really comes through that like extracurricular experience that I think is really hard to get, but I think is really effective in just creating systemic change that we all need and is critical to addressing the climate crisis.
Now, Sheetal, because of your global experience in India and China and here in the US, you know, I feel like you have a perspective that's incredibly unique. And maybe you can share a little bit about the common thread across that kind of work and what's happening in other countries compared to in the US. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can speak to two parts of it. So the first part is like the common thread in terms of impact of climate change. I think like I didn't realize growing up how adjacent to the climate crisis I was. You know, growing up in like polluted areas, I kind of just thought that was the way of life, you know, industrial cities, that's kind of how it goes. And then I moved to LA and I heard a lot of conversations here about differences in air quality in areas. Like I live near USC, which is closer to downtown. And then I had friends going to UCLA and people would complain about how the one good thing UCLA has is better air quality. Sorry, I'm still a USC student at heart. And so it was interesting to me to see how things like air quality and other environmental impacts are so relative worldwide. And so how like the patterns of environmental injustice that we see here in LA are played out on a global scale too. So I think one thing that I realized is that there's a lot more overlap between how to address climate issues in different countries. I thought, you know, obviously there has to be regional variation and policies have to be catered to individual cities and regions, but there's kind of like the same problems exist in different scales, right? Lower income communities of color are impacted by pollution because of industrialization being, you know, located in poor areas. That's true on a city level and on a like a national level, on a global level. So I think learning about how similar the issues are worldwide has been really helpful for me personally, because I think it's also allowed me to feel like whatever I learn here can probably be applied in like a different country, a different setting. And then in terms of the type of work being done in other countries, so I've engaged a little bit with climate action in China, but not in India. I worked at a environmental startup in Shanghai, one of the summers in college. And that was very interesting to me coming back to the US after and then getting more involved in climate action here, because it's just kind of a different setup in terms of over here, I think we see a lot more of youth activists and businesses kind of pushing forward climate action, whereas over there, it was kind of a little bit flipped where businesses were adapting to government regulations and government incentives. So kind of a different top-down versus bottom-up approach. So seeing that difference has been interesting for me too, because I think there's a middle ground where both those things can exist at the same time. And that's really what that's been helpful for.
That's really interesting. Thank you. You know, as I said at the top about in 2018, when Greta Thunberg first started striking, and then it sort of unleashed this incredible youth climate movement where we saw millions of people taking to the streets and calling for action. And it really, I think, shook up the like world leaders and sort of our perception of like who's engaged and the demands that are being made. And, you know, since the pandemic, those kinds of strikes, we really, you know, aren't seeing that in person. And, you know, you think about the 50th anniversary of Earth Day was it was pretty quiet and when it was supposed to be a huge event. And I'm wondering from each of your perspectives, how you think the pandemic has either helped the movement or hurt it. I'll let any of you take it. Delaney.
Yeah, no, personally, I think the pandemic has allowed for a lot of like cross-cultural, collaborative, inclusive work across regions worldwide among youth and adults, because programs have been established like the Mayor's Youth Council for Climate Action through like a virtual format, which allowed more departments to meet with young people to establish those critical relationships to help implement systemic change. And just Zoom's accessibility just allowed youth worldwide to connect and program together, and just hearing everyone's different perspectives and stories about climate change's impact on their communities, I think provides like a more global and holistic perspective to young people, which just helps ensure just equity and equality is just instilled in every climate movement, which is just so important. And I know at One Up Action, for example, like our administrative team is just made up of young people from multiple time zones and countries. And just with Zoom, it's so accessible and we're able to be really efficient in developing campaigns and programs which are able to reach an even larger audience as well. And also, I just personally believe just the time we've spent at home and this increased time through isolation and quarantine just has made us all realize our actual environmental footprint and just consumption levels. And with that, and just hopefully educating ourselves through like different materials and guidance, we've been able to change our lifestyles to hopefully become more sustainable as well. So I think overall, this actually has maybe helped the environmental movement through a more optimistic perspective, just because everything right now is so upsetting. But I think hopefully this is putting us in the right direction for like collaboration purposes.
Yeah, I agree with Delaney, actually. I think, financial and logistical barriers to entry have really been lowered in a lot of ways. Attending a conference like this virtually versus in person, that's so much easier for a lot of people, a lot more accessible for people who probably can't afford to commute to things like this. And I think also just in terms of education and, access to information, I feel like a lot of organizations have taken efforts to make their work and their support virtual and more accessible to people who are at home. And I think that's something that's going to continue afterwards. So that's a positive. I was involved with the Climate Reality Leadership Corps, which is Al Gore's climate nonprofit that does kind of a global leadership training every year. So that's usually in person in a bunch of different countries. And this year they did it entirely virtually. So it was a free virtual, like 1 week experience for anyone all around the world to get involved with. And it just, provided such a wealth of information for people looking to become activists that I think kind of the democratization of information we've seen in the last year is really a positive impact. I will say though, like I think the one kind of drawback I've been seeing, like Delaney, you mentioned that, people are kind of seeing our environmental impact and how that has been so visible during the pandemic. I agree. I wish there was a little bit more understanding of how the pandemic itself is linked to the climate crisis, because it is. And I think that's something that people haven't really grasped. They're like, oh yeah, they're two separate problems, when in reality, they're intersected.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Sheetal and Delaney said. And I also think that kind of one drawback, but also maybe a benefit of the pandemic is that, yes, the focus has definitely shifted maybe from the climate crisis to the pandemic. But at the same time, I think it kind of leaves this window for a green recovery. And we've seen how much we can adapt our lifestyles in such a short period of time that I think it does provide some hope for us to be able to really gear up. And once we kind of begin to move on from this pandemic, and gear up and start changing the way we live in order to adapt to the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think that's really true, Sasha. And just like how, once we set our mind to something, how powerful we can be as like a United States, united world in overcoming something as, significant as a pandemic, but also as the climate crisis. So I think it does show us the possibilities. So, you know, we have, the mayor still has time on his term, but if you were going to run for mayor and became mayor, please tell me what you would do on the climate crisis, maybe in your first 100 days in office. I'm going to start with you, Chantal, or unless you
I can't run for mayor. I'm not American, so I can't technically do that. But yeah, if I were in a position of similar authority, I think something that I would really want to focus on is intersectionality, and in particular, like implementing that into the educational system, because, you know, we were talking all day about how youth is so important, and how, you know, the future really lies in the young people and like their ability to convince older generations. So I think, you know, making sure that we have climate education incorporated into things like the California Core, which maybe you wouldn't be able to do like on a mayoral level, but a little higher, and implemented into, like we talked a little bit on the council this year about LAUSD and incorporating climate education in their curriculums. So I think having that be a priority would be really important for me. And especially ensuring that the climate education that they do receive is, you know, intersectional and focused on equity and focused on not just climate science, because I think people do need an understanding of that to grasp the issues, but also how climate change as a whole has disproportionately impacted communities of color. So that would be my main focus.
Great.
I would do a very similar thing to Chantal. I think that climate education is very important, especially at an elementary and middle school level, because these are very formative years, and it's kind of like learning a language. You have to start young so that it's ingrained in you. And I think it's very important, of course, to teach it as an intersectional issue, because when I think of all the different facets of our society, I don't think of any particular part of it that can't tie back to climate change or just environmental issues. And I think, yeah, it's important to approach it from an interdisciplinary perspective. It's not just a science perspective, but treat it as an issue that is more than just about the environment, but it's about people, and look at it from a historical perspective, a philosophical perspective. And I think, what else? Yeah, I think that's all I have for now.
Yeah, no, on a similar theme, I think a lot of potential like educational campaigns just for young people, but also just Angelinos in general, because I think without that clear, solid foundation and true understanding about the true implications of climate change on communities of color, we just can't get enough collective action to achieve that greener future that we all really want. And I think it's just so necessary to provide different programs for promoting composting, zero waste, a circular economy too, and just how it benefits each and every single Angelino, so everyone just feels included. Because I think sometimes people feel it's more of a corporation and they're the ones that can help tackle the climate crisis, but I think putting it on a more individualistic perspective too, and just making sure every Angelino feels included in their voices and just impact is valued. So without like clear communication from policymakers to Angelinos, there could be that space where misinformation could rise, and then just communities might feel that distrust between politicians and scientists. So I think having tons of educational campaigns out there talking about different programming that the city offers, and just a clear understanding on what climate change is and how it will impact each and every single Angelino, I think will help put us on the right direction towards a more sustainable and equitable future that we all hopefully want to achieve in a sooner time.
Thanks, Delaney. And, you know, before we sort of wrap up, I did want to share, and I'll share it in the chat, this LA Climate Stories initiative that we had put together this year through the Mayor's Youth Council for Climate Action. You'll see both Chantal and Sasha in the video. And it's sort of this idea of an educational campaign, but kind of connecting the individual stories of Angelinos to how climate change is affecting them personally. And so you have this huge existential crisis, but also just how it has this impact on the individual and the things that they've done. So we're really encouraging people, anyone, you don't have to be a young person, anyone, to submit your narrative about how climate change has impacted you and hopefully what it's inspired you to do in response. And then we're going to be posting those on the website. So last question, I would love to hear from all of you, because you all are just incredibly inspirational, is what advice, tricks, or tips do you have for young people concerned about climate change, and where do you hope to go from here? Chantal, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will be working in air quality. So I'm hoping to, get a little bit of more of a foundation in climate science, and then eventually work in policy work. I'm really interested in working in international policy. So kind of things like the Conference of Parties, working in international NGOs that kind of work to ensure that collaboration, like Delaney mentioned, which is like the cornerstone of climate work, is occurring on an international scale. So that's really where I hope to go eventually from here. And then in terms of advice, I have a few things. I think my first and foremost advice is to seek out mentors in the field. I think nothing has made me more excited and more optimistic about going into climate work as all of the people I've met who are working professionals in the field. People like Victoria, obviously, who are mentors through like a structured program, but also people who I've, just reached out to at events and panels and conferences like this one, who have really just gone above and beyond to take the time out to like have a half an hour or 1 hour phone call with me about their work, recommend me for fellowships and jobs, give me a really good insight into like the highs and lows of working in the climate sector. So I think my number one advice is to seek out those people. And a lot of the times, I think especially in this sector over other ones, people are inclined to help you even if they don't really know you. So send LinkedIn cold messages. They work all the time. You'd be surprised at how many people will respond and, pick up the phone and talk to you and just become people that you really just continue to talk to throughout your career. So I think that's my go-to advice for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Chantal. Networking is key, and also the worst thing that can happen is that the person doesn't respond, so you might as well go for it. Sasha?
In terms of advice I would have for a young person, I would say, 1, be persistent, don't give up. And 2, I would say, try to connect with other young, like-minded people. One thing that's been so great about the Mayor's Youth Council for Climate Action is that I've gotten to interact with such amazing people living in LA who are also passionate about environmental issues and climate change. And it's been really helpful for me to learn from them and connect with them. And in terms of regarding what my path forward, I want to continue to grow the high school sustainability guide and hopefully partner with other schools and students to help bring this to not just California, but beyond in the United States and hopefully globally. And this summer, I'm planning on interning at the World Resources Institute, which will be a great experience. And also, I just, as a general goal, I would love to just continue to educate myself about climate change and issues surrounding the environment, because they are never ending. So, yes.
Thanks, Sasha. Delaney?
Yeah, so after college, I hope just to continue educating as many people as possible about climate change and their overall environmental footprint. Maybe I'll apply to graduate school, hopefully maybe in Europe, to get that global perspective on climate change and climate action. And then after that, my dream job is possibly working for an international governing body, kind of like the United Nations, where I could delegate work to inform just politicians and community members on different regulations and policies they could incorporate into their communities. And I think just for young people curious about getting involved in the environmental movement, just like Sasha was saying, read as many articles as you can, hopefully figure out if they're credible or not, so you're not unintentionally consuming misinformation, and just apply to as many fellowships and programs and internships as possible, just because I think experience is key, especially for future careers. You'll know exactly what avenue, hopefully, or field you want to pursue, and just continue advocating for just climate action in our futures, because we only have so many years left to reverse the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Delaney. Thank you to all three of you. You know, it's been a real inspiration working with all of you through the past 2 years. And I know without a doubt that we will keep working together no matter what you're doing, because it's a small world and you all are doing some incredible stuff. So as Kate said in the chat, you guys are the good kind of trouble, and keep it up.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you. That panel was amazing. It was inspirational. It's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for, just as an organization in our community and what we need in our region. If there's any way we can help support the work that you're doing, please let us know. But you all are indeed our future, and I love sessions like these because it reminds me why we do what we do. Like it feels so hard sometimes when you're working against something as big as climate change. But to know that there's others that are there, they're going to be carrying the torch and continue to move things forward, just really is inspiring. So thank you so much for your time this morning. And thank you, Victoria, for moderating our panel. And now we're going to release you to our second set of sessions this morning. We have our second session of our green schools for either elementary or secondary school. We have an introduction to green building certifications, which is usually really helpful for folks who are trying to figure out where to invest their time to get something to help them with the career going forward. We have a great session on mobilization of climate change and its impacts on communities. And then we also have another session called Community Engagement 101, how to just not build, but to be a partner in the community. So please check those out. After that, we'll have our closing keynote, and then we'll have a performance from A.Y. Young, who's an amazing artist who's really aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. And we're hoping to bring him to LA in 2022 for his battery tour. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you here in a few minutes.